Dan and Clarissa had been the envy of their college. Dan, with his steady job as an engineer and his quiet dependability, was the perfect foil for Clarissa's vibrant personality and blossoming social media career. They were a whirlwind of laughter and stolen glances, seemingly destined for a happily ever after. "Look at them," Jessica nudged Sarah, their friend from their dorm days. "They're practically glowing." "Seriously," Sarah replied, watching Dan help Clarissa twirl in a new dress at the bridal boutique. "I don't know how they do it. They've been together forever, and they're still crazy about each other." They'd been dating for 5 years and were not planning their dream wedding. Clarissa, a whirlwind of activity, flitted between designer boutiques and caterers. Dan, meticulous by nature, planned the logistics, a touch overwhelmed by the sheer volume of decisions. "Honey, relax." Clarissa squeezed his hand during a particularly stressful venue meeting. "It'll all come together. Just trust me." Dan smiled, the familiar warmth spreading through him. He did trust her completely. One seemingly ordinary Tuesday night shattered his perfect world. He was at a bar with his best friend Mark, enjoying a rare night off, when he spotted Clarissa across the crowded room. "Mark," he rasped, his voice barely a whisper. "Dude, what's wrong?" Mark asked, concern lacing his voice. Mark followed Dan's gaze, his brow furrowing as he saw Clarissa laughing intimately with a handsome stranger. Dan shook his head, unable to tear his eyes away. Clarissa was supposed to be out with her girlfriends, but they definitely weren't there. But this strange man was. Their laughter and the lingering touches, it all screamed intimacy. Dan couldn't bring himself to see where this was going. He wanted to walk over to Clarissa and have it out right there and then, but Mark stopped him. He reasoned with his friend, pointing out that if Dan really wanted to learn the truth, he needed to be smart about it. Mark suggested hiring a private investigator to tail Clarissa to see what she was up to, but Dan was in no state of mind to think logically. Although he did decide against confronting her at the bar and simply went home. The following days were a blur of sleepless nights and choked back anger. He was pondering Mark's suggestion, but somehow he felt like Clarissa deserved a chance to tell her side of the story, as if hiring someone to tail her would betray her trust. Dan knew that it sounded insane. She clearly betrayed his trust already, but he still wasn't ready to take that step. So Dan decided to first have a talk with Clarissa. Her initial defensiveness crumbled under the weight of his shaky phone video, blurry but undeniable. "Damn, it was a stupid mistake," she pleaded, tears welling in her eyes. "It meant nothing. We were having a rough patch, and you were always so busy with work." "A rough patch?" Dan's voice was cold. "You call planning a wedding a rough patch? And even if that were true, would it really justify throwing away everything we have?" Clarissa reached for his hand, but he recoiled. The image of her with another man was burned into his mind, a betrayal that echoed in the silence that had fallen between them. Dan didn't know what he expected, but Clarissa's mumbled justifications and apologies didn't make him feel any better. He couldn't shake the gnawing suspicion. The wedding countdown continued, a constant reminder of the life they were supposed to be building together, now hanging by a thread. Dan couldn't forget, couldn't forgive. "I can't marry you like this, Clarissa," he finally said, his voice heavy. "Dan, please," she sobbed. "We can work through this. I love you." "You don't cheat on someone you love, Clarissa. This isn't how it works." Dan was getting angrier by the second. "Please don't cancel the wedding. Let's go into therapy. Let's work this out, please, Dan. I really do love you, and I'll do everything in my power to win back your trust." Dan took pause, digging deep into himself, trying to find at least some indication that he could trust Clarissa ever again. "Fine, let's try and work this out." But the spark in his eyes, the one that had always been mirrored in Clarissa's eyes, was gone. Dan knew then that their love story was over. He made a decision, a drastic one, fueled by a potent mix of hurt and anger. He took his friend's advice and hired a private investigator, a shadow-trailing Clarissa, documenting her every move. The evidence accumulated, each photo, each receipt a fresh stab of pain. It wasn't just one mistake. Now Dan really knew it was all over. It took Dan about every ounce of strength he had not to confront Clarissa again with all this evidence he now had, but at this point, he needed her to pay for what she did. The wedding day arrived. It was a perfect summer afternoon, marred only by the unspoken tension that crackled in the air. Guests buzzed with anticipation, oblivious to the storm brewing beneath the surface. Clarissa, radiant in her white gown, walked down the aisle on her father's arm. Dan stood at the altar, a mask of composure barely concealing the turmoil within. The couple had one of their best friends from college officiate the wedding. They also prepared a video for their guests. It was pictures of their love story developing through the years. The officiant gave a brief introduction to the video, and a hush fell over the guests, cameras flashing in anticipation. A projector screen descended, casting a festive glow on the tearful faces. The officiant pressed the button, and the video started playing. However, instead of the love story, photos of Clarissa and some stranger flashed across the screen, a montage of stolen moments captured in stark detail. Audible gasps filled the room. Clarissa's face drained of color, the carefully constructed facade crumbling before her eyes. "What is this?" her father boomed, his voice filled with disbelief. "The truth, sir," Dan replied, his voice steady despite the tremor in his heart. Clarissa turned to him, her eyes filled with a desperate plea. "Dan, please don't do this." But Dan was done. He had loved her, trusted her, and she'd betrayed that trust. This wasn't just about revenge. It was about reclaiming his dignity. "I deserve better than this," he said, his voice cracking slightly. He turned away, the weight of the broken promises heavy on his shoulders. He walked out, leaving behind a stunned silence and the shattered remnants of a fairy tale wedding. The applause that was supposed to greet their vows was replaced by the relentless clicking of cameras capturing Clarissa's humiliation. Guests erupted in a flurry of murmurs and shocked whispers. Some stared at Clarissa with judgment, others with a morbid curiosity. Her father, red-faced with fury, stormed towards her, his voice barely audible over the growing commotion. Clarissa stood frozen, tears streaming down her ruined makeup. The dream wedding she'd been planning for months had become a public spectacle, her carefully crafted online persona shattered. The weight of her betrayal hung heavy in the air, suffocating and inescapable. News of the wedding fiasco spread like wildfire. Social media, once Clarissa's carefully curated kingdom, turned into a breeding ground for judgment and scorn. The pictures, leaked by an anonymous guest, went viral. "Perfect couple's perfect storm. Wedding day betrayal." The headlines screamed, each one a fresh stab to Dan's already wounded heart. Despite the pain, a sense of vindication washed over him. It wasn't as much about humiliating Clarissa as it was about exposing the truth, reclaiming his dignity, and escaping a future built on deceit.